we were talking about buffer systems, and these are buffer systems, particularly the three that we are talking about, whether it's intracellular or extracellular. These are temporary. They temporarily neutralize acids. They're temporarily and fast acting, I guess you might say. The major shifts of acid-base balance is done between the respiratory system and the urinary system. But if in fact a fast shift needs to take over, that's going to happen via these buffers that we're talking about. The one that we are mentioning in some detail is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, and it has certain limitations. It can't protect your extracellular fluid from changes in pH that result from carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide is the end product or the beginning product, depending on what you're looking at. And it can only function when the respiratory system is normal, when you have normally functioning respiratory system. For example, the respiratory system is diminished or increased, it won't, this system can't work because it's based on carbon dioxide. And its ability to buffer acids is based on the availability of bicarbonate ions. So you have that reserve, that sodium bicarbonate reserve, and the ability for those that to turn into bicarbonate ions would limit or restrict its ability to actually maintain pH of blood in a certain area. Respiratory rate can change, and again, so if in fact there is an increase of hydrogen ions, respiratory rate can change, fall, and rise. Carbon dioxide in blood is converted to the bicarbonate ion and transported to the plasma. This increases hydrogen ion, so if you have I guess maybe we'll look at this. If you have an addition of hydrogen ions, that can then get together with bicarbonate, form carbonic acid, and then you have increased respiration. And then that, in fact, would lower blood pH. But that will deplete or use some of the carbonate reserves. The renal response to increased hydrogen ions is going to be to secrete more hydrogen ions. Again, these are the larger systems, but they aren't as fast acting as the local buffers. And then acid-base regulation with regard to respiratory acidosis kind of repeats the information that we just saw, but it's in more of cycle form. You have hypoventilation, so you're breathing too fast, causing an increase of CO2. Elevated CO2 results in a fall of plasma pH. So plasma pH, that is going to lead to respiratory compensation, renal compensation, and a buffer system. So the carbonic acid buffer system accepts the hydrogen ions. So that then decreases the CO2, decreases hydrogen ion, and increases bicarbonate. Restores our plasma pH back to normal. So hypoventilation, I'm sorry I said hyper, I think, so lower than normal ventilation, meaning you aren't breathing out as much CO2 as what would be considered normal. And that then is going to increase the acidity of blood, and that increase in acidity of blood then needs to be compensated via the buffer system, renal, and respiratory system. And then this would be respiratory alkalosis. So what you have here is hyperventilation. So causing an increase of CO2, that then is going to cause a rise in plasma pH, and the compensation is going to be inhibition of atrial and cerebrospinal fluid receptors resulting in a decreased respiratory rate, so it's going to slow that respiratory rate down. Ions and bicarbonate ions are going to be secreted, and buffer system other than the carbonic acid buffer system is going to release hydrogen ions. Again, remember, because our problem is too much CO2, that then is going to increase hydrogen, decrease bicarbonate, and restore pH. This in alkalosis, respiratory alkalosis. Local buffer systems are going to be able to work. Remember, you have proteins in your, they have a protein buffer system that can work. It's going to bring the blood pH back to normal. And then, acidosis can be respiratory, alkalosis can be respiratory. So you can have respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis. You can also have metabolic alkalosis and acidosis. This is your scenario with regard to metabolic acidosis. The homeostatic disturbance is that you have an increased hydrogen production or a decrease of hydrogen exertions. So this increased acid production or decreased hydrogen excretion, not exertion, excretion, can be for various reasons, and we'll look at these reasons. But if you have an increase, this increase of hydrogen production can be because you're making too much in your digestive system, particularly your stomach, but results in elevated hydrogen. So the pH, the plasma pH becomes more acidic. The compensation will be respiratory. That will increase respiratory rate, so breathe those out. Renal, increased hydrogen secretion, and buffer system to accept hydrogen. So you have a buffer system, renal and respiratory regulation based on stimulation that is picked up by atrial and CSF chemoreceptors. That combined will bring back homeostasis. That's metabolic acidosis. And then you have metabolic alkalosis. Sorry, this looks like the same slide. Oh, no, this isn't the same slide. Sorry, if you have decreased bicarbonate ions, remember the bicarbonate ions are what's actually going to be able to take those hydrogen ions out of circulation. So you have a bicarbonate loss, and that bicarbonate loss can be for various reasons. But that then you have no bicarbonates to accept that hydrogen ion, so you actually have an acid situation because that buffer has been compromised. That then is going to have the compensation, and you have it back, you have it restored again. Sorry, I was a little confused there for a second. And then suspected disorders with regard to respiratory or metabolic acidosis. You have an example of a problem with regard to metabolic acidosis would be an increase in diarrhea, an increase in lactic acid, so lactic acidosis, an increase in ketone bodies, ketoacidosis, and then chronic liver failure. So if either of those two major organ systems that are able to maintain acid-base balance are not working properly, either your lungs or your kidneys, you can have problems with that. So metabolic acidosis decreased, you can have acute or chronic, which is tends to be due to respiratory decreased and due to respiratory compensation. And that means you basically you're breathing out hydrogen ions faster than normal. Or you can have respiratory acidosis. That can be acute or chronic. Examples of acute respiratory acidosis would be respiratory failure, CNS damage, or if you have a problem with actually getting gas exchange, like a pneumothorax. In terms of chronic or compensated would be emphysema or asthma, where basically what it means by compensated is the body has somewhat adapted to it. It may not be, it's still not considered normal because it's a disease state, but the body has adapted to it. Suspected alkalosis disorders. So you have metabolic alkalosis and respiratory alkalosis. Metabolic alkalosis examples is vomiting, loss of gastric acid in terms of alkalosis. So if you're vomiting out the acids in the stomach, you have a change in pH with regard to systemic, because that's where a major part of your of the acids come from. And then respiratory alkalosis, primary cause is hyperventilation. So alkalosis, hyperventilation, you're breathing out too many hydrogen ions. In terms of acute respiratory alkalosis, so acute and chronic we're talking about with respiratory alkalosis, fever, panic attacks with the acute alkalosis, and anemia and CNS damage with the compensated respiratory alkalosis. Kind of compare and contrast here. This is our last one. We're more or less, what we've done is we've just taken those two and put them together here on one slide, because there will be questions about what is metabolic acidosis, what is respiratory acidosis. I won't ask any questions about between the acute and chronic. It's just very, very interesting. And then particularly in lab, we talk about the causes of each of them, so that I added them here. And also so you have an appreciation of why do we study so many of these regulatory mechanisms. They aren't as well understood, I guess, is what I'm saying, why one would even need to study this material, or why it would be important to study. And we will move on to the next chapter.